good to go.
All right, welcome everybody. We are ready to do some Copic coloring and some card making today here with myself, Michelle Houghton. I am a Copic craft educator and have been teaching Copic for, gosh, it's been about 14 years now that I've been teaching people how to use these fun markers. And I work directly with Two Corporation, which is the Copic manufacturer. I work with them a little bit to create some of their education stuff. And then we're here with Michaels to share just a fun class and way to use the markers, but then also a way to put them together in a fun, creative way. So while we're still having a few people in, I'll give you guys just a really brief introduction if you're brand new to Copic markers. They are an alcohol-based marker. And what that means is they're a little bit different than the markers we used as kids. So a lot of us, when we were elementary age, like in our first grade art class or second grade, we were using Crayolas or the Mr. somethings that had the fun smell to them, and those are all water-based markers, and it means that the ink, the chemical that has the actual colorant in it, is suspended in water. So an alcohol-based marker has those chemicals or those dyes suspended in alcohol instead. And what that means for us as artists is a couple things. First of all, those inks can blend together, meaning we can use them almost like paints. We can layer them and blend them. And so that's a huge advantage over those water-based markers, is that we can use them that way. But the other thing is they don't tear up your paper. So remember when you would color a spot over and over again with a Crayola marker, it would kind of tear up the paper and just beat up and get all kind of, it would get so wet it would actually kind of break down those fibers. Alcohol markers won't do that. It stays on the surface, the alcohol evaporates, and so you can use layer after layer without that effect. So that part is awesome. And then Copic is just one of the many brands of them out there, but it probably is the highest quality you can buy. It comes in a couple different body styles. So the one we're going to use today are these little round guys called the chows, or that I'm going to use today. I should put it that way. These are called the chows, and these are the smallest of the different bodies or the style they come in. But just so you guys know, any of the Copic markers, if you have a marker with the same number on it, as even if it's a different looking body, it's the exact same color. So it doesn't matter, the colors are the same from body to body. So if I have this guy here that's a G82, if I have it in a different body, meaning a sketch marker that's kind of an oval shape, or one of the classics or original that's square, if it says G82 on there, it's the exact same ink inside. So that's kind of a cool thing, that if I end up with some from different bodies, they all mix together. So we're going to use a couple of those guys today. Before I get going and started, if you haven't pulled it up yet on your screen, if you are interested in asking questions or kind of checking in, I've got two friends with me today from Copic, and they are Karina and Shannon, and they're going to be fielding questions over in that chat area. And so they will type answers as quickly as they can if you've got questions. But also there's a couple spots in class today that I've already told them ahead of time. If you guys have questions that need answered by me, they're going to interrupt me and say, hey, Michelle, we need more info, or we need you to do something else. And so they'll make sure if you need to see something more closely, or anything that we can help you with, we will get that answered. So it's Shannon and Karina are over there today, and they can help get those questions to me. And whoever said, Penny, you're right, it's Mr. Sketch, the scented markers. So yes, they're great. And we all walked out of art class with the dot of ink on our nose. I know you're all laughing because you all did the same thing, but you'd pick your favorite color and you'd hold it right up against your nose, and you'd walk out of art with a little dot of that color on your nose. At least I always did, because they were fun to sniff. because they smelled like grape and orange and all the yummy stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm gonna have a switch over to my tabletop. Thank you very much. And what we're aiming for today is a shaker card. And this is the sample. And so when we talk about shaker cards, it means there are elements inside a little compartment that shake around. So we are going to actually put one of these together today. The Copic coloring is on this portion right here, these little wreath portions. And the stamp set that I am using is a Recollections stamp set, and it's a wreath building set. So we've got these couple of pieces that then you can either add around a ring or build on top of that. So a lot of different uses for a set like this. So I use this top kind of flower portion here, and I've stamped it up a couple times. And then I also used one of the sentiments out of the set, and I used Best Wishes. You could use the love, or you could do the thank you instead of that if you wanted to. So we're going to do our coloring first, and then I'll show you all the pieces of the card and kind of how to put those all together. So we've got this little guy stamped out, and I will do both of them because I need two of them for the card. Remember, I've got one at the top and at the bottom. So I'll do both of them. The coloring today is actually fairly simple. There's only 3 colors that I'm using. I've got a blue, and this one is a B99. I've got a blue-green, BG for blue-green, and then 7-2. And then I've got a green with a G82. Now, if you don't have those exact colors, if you have something similar, a lot of times that's going to work because Copic markers are going to blend together even if they aren't the exact same colors. And these are kind of a big stretch. We've got some big jumps in value today, but they still work. So I'm actually going to start with my darkest marker today. And I don't do that all the time, but I'm going to start with that B99. And I'm going to start toward the interior of the flower. And I'm going to work on these petals that are kind of facing me. So I'm going to go right near the center of the flower. And I'm using the brush nib on the chow. And I'm going to work up from the center. I'm going to come a little bit further up where those little veins are on the petal. And there's really only a few petals facing me. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that on each of these petals. So I'm coming from the base, kind of where it hits the center of the flower, and I'm going up from that spot. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 petals, and I've just added a small amount of that B99 on each of them. Then I'm going to come over and I'm going to grab my BG72. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to color in the petal, and I'm going to go right over the top of that B99, that blue ink that I colored in. What's going to happen is the alcohol from the blue-green hits that dark blue. You're going to see that B99 kind of start to dissolve, and the edge is going to get real fuzzy. So I can go back and forth a little bit if I think that it's a kind of taking too much of that B99 away, but I'm going to go through each of the petals first. So I'm going to start in the white area, and then I'm going to come down and hit that edge of the B99.
Hey, Michelle.
Yeah.
While you're coloring right here, we have a question.
Yep.
What cardstock are you using today?
So this is actually, it's an Express It. So it's literally the letter X and then press it. So it's a brand of smooth white cardstock. but this particular one is from Express It.
Okay.
I find that I use about 3 different brands, and I tend to use a smooth white cardstock. Um, this is one that is super smooth, like it's slick to the touch. Marker papers work extremely well as well. So finding kind of that cardstock weight in a marker paper or a smooth white cardstock is going to be really the best. And then testing it out, kind of experimenting a little bit if you can, is really helpful.
Oh, thank you so much. And
Absolutely.
is this a heavyweight cardstock or is it more like a midweight?
So the Express It tends to be would be considered a heavyweight.
Gotcha.
Um, very similar to like ones that you would see the 110 pound, like a Hammer Mill or Nina, be very similar to that.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. And
Absolutely.
what stamp did you use to adhere this on the paper, this design? Because there's no smudging and it looks really clean on your paper. Is there a specific brand that you recommend?
Of the ink,
Yes.
stamping ink. Yep. I tend to look for either a dye ink or a hybrid ink. This particular ink is Memento, which is one of the most popular Copic inks that's out there, and you can find that at Michael's. It's an easy one to find. Memento Tuxedo Black is what this one is.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I've got those petals that are facing me pretty much colored in, at least all of the ones that also had that blue. I'm going to go ahead and fill in this top little petal. And then I've got these ones that are kind of curling up toward me. So I'm seeing the interior of the petal, and then I'm seeing underneath. I'm seeing that backside. So I am going to add a little bit more of my B99. I'm going to come to this very bottom edge. And I'm going to come right up under, and I'll get this closer so you guys can see what I did there. So this is that B99, and I almost filled in that bottom portion where I'm seeing the kind of that under kind of cupped area on the flower. I almost filled it in. There's a teeny tiny spot of white. If you lost it, that's absolutely okay. Every time I do this, it's a question mark if I'll lose it or not. I'm going to switch back to my BG72, and I'm going to fill in that petal piece that is kind of flipping over and facing me. And one of the really neat things about Copic is I can go back in and do adjustments. I actually can go back in and touch up, add a little bit more of that B99 in places I want to push back or make it look like it delves in deeper. Or I can come back and do a little more blending. Even if it feels like it's completely dry, I can come back and work those colors and they'll still soften and dissolve and blend together. So that's kind of that flower portion. I'm going to switch back to my blue, that B99. The fun part about this one today is there's really only the 3 markers to work with, which makes this go kind of fast and quick. And I'm literally going to go to each one of these little leaves, and I'm going to go right to the base, like where it connects into the stem. I'm going to add one little kind of just touch of this B, this dark blue, right at the center and bottom corner. And on the little tiny ones, I'm not going to try. So these mid-sized ones and the bigger ones are what I'm aiming for. But I'm not going to try to go into these little teeny tiny kind of fringy guys. Almost looks like a baby's breath or buds. I'm going to ignore those, but I'm going to go into all of these other leaves and give them just this little touch of the B99. And I'm going to do half of the flower first, or half of the foliage first. And as soon as I've got those, now I'm going to switch all the way over to my green. And this was that G82. Same thing that I did with my blue-green on the petals. I'm going to start out in the white and I'm going to come down and touch into that dark blue. The reason this works, and I hope this makes sense, the reason this works where the blue is dissolving, even though these two colors are so extremely different, is the fact that they're so extremely different. So that blue ends in the number 9. So remember, it's a G or B99. That last number is a 9. On my green and my blue-green, it ends in a 2. The last number is a 2. That means there's a lot more alcohol in the solution on my blue-green and my green. It's a lighter color and it has more of that alcohol solution in there. So when all of that alcohol and that lighter marker touches that darker color, it just helps it just dissolve and get those edges nice and fuzzy and kind of blend those two colors together. So it makes it possible to do these kind of extreme jumps from light to dark. One thing I'm going to do as I kind of cross over to the second side is I am going to fill in the center of the flower real lightly with that G82, and I'll get these guys close to you so you can see that blue and green blended together. So simple, simple. And then we're going to go over on the second side and do exactly the same thing. So starting with our blue, coming right into the center kind of corner or base of each of these leaves. Just little tiny touches with that dark blue. And then we'll come back with the green. One of the things I forget, and I'm saying this to remind myself, but also you, is that typically as crafters or artists, when we're using a stamped image like this, it's very small. So don't forget just to turn your paper around. Face it in a direction that's comfortable for your hand to work. You don't have to crank your arm and turn it a separate direction or kind of crawl across your table. You can always turn that little piece of paper underneath you to get an angle that works for you, that you see the image well, and that your hand is working in a direction that it likes to work. Most of us, our hands want to go in one direction. So remember to keep turning that piece of paper so that it's comfortable for you. It does not have to stay upright. There is nothing typically locking that down to the table. All right. So we've got one little flower almost done. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add one little detail into the center of our flower. And it's going to be really, really subtle. But I'm going to grab my blue-green, the BG72, and I'm going to go right along this bottom edge, kind of right next to the petal that's folding over, and I'm going to add some little tiny dots with my blue-green. So it's a little bit darker down at this edge where we see it kind of come up over that petal. But that's it. Just a little touch of that color to give a little variation there so it's not that solid green color. So this is one. I'm going to set this one aside and I'm going to bring another one over because I need 2 of them, and I'm just going to start coloring. So if there are questions, this is a good time to field a few of those. If there are not, I can share a little bit more about kind of picking different color combos. So I'm going to start with my blue and blue-green on the petals. And then I'll do my blue and green on the leaves. But I'm literally going to repeat the process of what I just did on my previous set. So Shannon, do we have any other questions right now?
Yeah, there's a few that are coming up in the chat, and one that I just answered, and you're showing it actually right now with how colors blend together. And Dee asked if any of the lighter colors will pick up the darker tones. And I think you're going to show that right here as you feather with that BG. Is it BG 72?
Yep,
Okay,
it is.
okay. Just want to make sure. And
Yeah.
how it picks up the darker pigment and leaves more of a feathered effect rather than a straight line. And let's see. Oh, Cheryl says, does the ink soak through to the other side of the paper?
Yes.
It's always a
So,
good question.
so I am a non-paper waster person, so I apologize. This has an image on the back. But you can also see the ink coming through to the back side. So there's even just the single petal that I've done. And you can see where it's coming through. And that's very typical with Copic ink. And it's not something you're going to solve by switching papers. Most of the time, especially if you're blending similar to how I'm blending, you're going to have quite a bit of bleed through. And I don't know, Shannon, that previous question, she might have been asking also if it picks up on the marker itself.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that was the question.
I'm trying to read through the chat here and make sure I understood correctly.
So if it was, when I go in and hit that darker color with my lighter marker, it does not pick it up on the marker itself. It's not contaminating the marker, if that was the question, because it might have been just the way you said it. That might have been part of the question.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Sorry, I think I
no,
misunderstood.
absolutely. I think sometimes, I mean, part of this, I think I've been asked some of those questions before, so it makes sense when somebody asked it. That's a pretty common one.
Yes, and I think I want to ask this just myself, but when you move that segment that you're working on now, does the marker ink bleed onto your like workstation, like that piece of paper you're working on that's
So
protecting your desk?
it will, where I have like two or three colors, if I'm not shifting the paper around at all, I will get
Just a few.
just
Okay.
a few. Yeah. So I tend to work on like a clean sheet of just like white copy paper.
Mm.
Um, I know some people work on more of a non-porous surface, and there's some reasons for that. Um, but for a lot of beginners, this is an easy way to start. I try to make sure it's clean as I'm starting a new project because of that bleed through, so that I'm not picking things back up.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And while we're coloring here, I might as well keep asking some questions, but
Yeah.
when you're working, how long do you think it takes for the ink to dry?
Ooh.
Because
So
it's a hard one to answer.
a little bit. So if I'm working, which most of the time I am, which if I'm working on a non or a porous surface like paper, like a cardstock, it actually does not take that long to dry, especially if it's just a single layer of ink. Um, I would guess it's maybe a minute, maybe a little less than that. Where I see a little bit longer drying time is one I've put a heavy coat of a color. Sometimes when I'm coloring something like a face and I really want it to end up smooth, I'll make a point of putting a really thick coat for my base layer, and that'll take maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes to dry. But the point is, I want it wet. And so I've really saturated the paper. And by keeping it wet, I sometimes will have an easier time blending the ink together. So if I can work fairly quickly within that kind of even couple minutes, I'm going to have an easier time blending those colors together while that ink is slightly damp. If it's not as important to get a super smooth blend, I can let them dry and even come back the next day and I can still blend them together. It takes a little more work, but it's pretty fast. It actually, that turnaround from when the ink, like these little tiny dots of ink that I'm putting into the little tiny petals, I mean, those are probably dry within 30 seconds because it's just that light, almost dot or touch with the marker.
I'm going to ask another surface or paper question here, but
Yeah.
so it seems like you like to work on these heavyweight, more so papers and surfaces. But what
Mhm.
about maybe like a thinner marker paper or maybe a slick paper? Do you recommend those for using Copic with?
So one of the really neat things about Copic is you can work on just about any kind of surface. You can actually work on even plastics and metal. It will stick to those surfaces. Um, each, when you vary kind of the surface, meaning non-porous or porous, so like a cardstock versus getting a thinner, more plasticky surface or one that isn't as porous, the markers are going to look different on top of them. And so if I switched over to something that was super slick, like even a photo paper or something like Yupo, which is used a lot in mixed media now, I can color on that. Absolutely. And it's going to stick and it will take longer to dry, but it will eventually dry, but it's going to be a completely different look. It wouldn't look like the blending that you're seeing on the flower would not look like that at all. It would look, um, the color sits more side by side. They kind of knock into each other and don't blend as well on those non-porous like a plastic or slick surface. Um,
Oh, I see. So it would more so the ink would sit on top rather than kind of soak into the paper.
yep,
Ah, so
exactly.
those pigments don't really give time to dry, so they're sitting on the surface.
Yep.
Um, I see. And whenever you're using Copics, do you ever try mixed media with them, say with pencils or acrylic or anything like that?
So I do. Um, so for a lot of time, people have used them, and the general rule, and I'm going to give the exception to the rule here in just a second. The general rule is that if you're going to use Copics with mixed media, you put the Copic down first, and then you do the other medium on top of it. Meaning, if you're going to come back with colored pencils, you're going to come back with doodling, you're going to come back with oil pastels or paint, you would put the Copic first, and then you would come back and add the other medium on top of the Copic. Um, that being said, and the reason for that is the alcohol in the Copics literally will re-liquefy your paints. It can kind of gum up your markers with the oils from the oil pastels or chalk pastels. You can actually pick those things up in your marker and gum up the nibs. That all being said, if you're aware of that and know that you can replace the nibs, some people then have gone back and said, I can replace the nibs. I want to try working on top of acrylic paint. I want to try working on top of watercolor or colored pencil. There's a few that I wouldn't recommend because they're kind of an automatic death sentence for your nibs. And so you are going to have to replace them. There's a couple, though, that if you're careful, you can still work on top of, just knowing you're going to have to kind of keep scrubbing off some of those materials and those mediums. So I have done some experimenting with watercolor, colored pencil. I've actually worked with gesso and acrylic paint, um, and sometimes on top of and sometimes underneath. But yes, I have absolutely experimented with mixed media.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So we've got two little flowers. I'm going to show you guys real quick all the pieces for the card, and then we'll kind of keep going on this. Set these guys aside. So I've got a card base, which is kind of our standard size. So if it's unfolded, this piece of paper is 8.5 by 5.5. And then you fold that in half. So we have the 4.25 by 5.5. And this is a very standard size card. So I've got my little card base. And then I have a piece of purple cardstock that is cut to the same size as my card base. So that's going to literally cover up. And the reason I do just the single kind of half sheet instead of making my entire card out of the purple is now when I open it, I've got that white surface to write on. So I'm not having to put like an insert inside of the card. So that's why I do it that way. Then I've got kind of a cream color cardstock, and this is where I've stamped kind of right in the center. And I'll be honest, I eyeballed this. I did not measure it. I eyeballed it. I tend to do that with all of my projects. So things don't always end up perfectly straight or square, but this is where I put my sentiment. So I did use a stamp platform, which is one of those that I can restamp a couple times and make sure it's nice and has that rich black. I will tell you that if you decided to do the thank you sentiment, for what we're doing with the shaker card, you'd want to put the thank and then you underneath it so it fits inside the shaker. Okay, if you tried to do it side by side, it's going to kind of go outside your shaker. So those are the card pieces. I've got my two flowers that I'm going to need to cut out here in a minute. And then I've got a bunch of little squares. And what I did is I used two square, these are part of a nesting set of square dies. And I used two of them. And I used like a washi tape to kind of attach them so they were this kind of equal distance apart. And I made a bunch of cardstock squares, and they're all just white cardstock. It doesn't even matter what kind. And I think I did, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8. I actually did 10 of these guys. And as I'm putting it together, I'll kind of explain why I chose to go this route. I've got one more that's exactly the same out of this kind of teal, and it has a little shimmer to it, cardstock. And then I used the larger square to cut out a sheet of kind of crafting plastic. Now, this does not have to be crafting plastic. It can be one that you would have bought for your printer to run through to kind of create kind of a overhead projector type copy. So there's not a specific kind of plastic that is helpful for this. I know this particular sheet happens to be for crafting, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. And then I have a fun little bag of sequins and glitter. And this is just a combination that I put a bunch of similar colors in a bag all together. And so it's sitting waiting for me to do with cards. And I did this to coordinate with the colors I used in the card. But again, this is one of those fun projects that you could change and make any color combination you want. You could do it more appropriately for spring with pinks and yellows. You could do something with purples, and you could really vary this a lot depending on what you want to do with it. The one other little quick note I'll give you before we start actually attaching this and cutting those flowers out is I had done another one of these with a circle set instead of the squares. So again, that's an easy way. If you already have the circle nesting, you could even do it with an oval set of nesting dies. You can change that shape extremely easily. It does not have to be the square that I used. So when I start putting this together, you're going to see kind of why that works and how that works. So, all right. So the first thing I actually need to do is to cut this out. So we're going to do a little fussy cutting, and I'll give you a couple tips, and then if there are more questions, we can absolutely answer that. All right, so fussy cutting, and I'm going to do at least one of these. How are we on time? Are we? I didn't even check. Oh, we're perfect. Never mind, we're spectacular. So my goal is going to be to cut kind of close to those leaves in the flower. So I'm going to get probably within almost like a 1/16 of an inch. I'm not going to measure it. I'm not getting a ruler out, ladies and gentlemen. If there's any gentlemen out there, I'm just going to get close. So there's a small white edge, but I'm not going to try to cut right on that black line. There's too many details like into those interior of the vine that it's no, not going to do it. So fussy cutting 101 here. Small, sharp scissors. You want to actually get a little pair of scissors that are made to do this. It's going to make your job a whole heck of a lot easier. You're going to want to trim down your image so it's a smaller piece of paper to start, so you're not dealing with something massive. Then, whichever hand you are dominant with, I'm a right-hander, that's where my scissors are. Those scissors are going to stay pointed away from me, and they're going to just kind of slowly keep moving. So I'm going to keep closing them down. I'll shift and just close them down and kind of keep them moving. But again, they're pointed away from me. My left hand is going to move the paper. So it's going to move the image into the scissors. So I'm going to come in and I'm just going to start cutting, and it's not going to be perfect, but you're going to see for the most part that pair of scissors is going to stay pointed away from me. And then I'm going to shift the paper with my left hand. And I try to keep kind of a constant pressure on the scissors. Now, the one thing I'm going to forgive myself for, because I know it's not going to be perfect, is some of those widths away from the leaves are going to be a little different each time. Sometimes it'll get thin, sometimes it'll get a little thicker, might even come down and just barely touch on some of those black lines. I am completely okay with that. And then I'm going to cut a chunk off. So see, I've got a piece. I'm going to get rid of that excess white paper, and that's going to help me get all the way around the image. So as I do the next section, I'm probably going to chunk another section off as I go. It's going to make it way easier to keep cutting. But I'm just going to work my way kind of slowly around all the way around the image. The other thing you might have noticed, this image has some cute little black dots added on it, and several of those are getting lost. They're getting cut off. I'm not trying to necessarily keep those on. I'm going to add a few of them back in at the very end of putting my card together. So I'm not going to come out and like grab this little black dot out here. I'm going to ignore that, and I'm just going to let it go. I'll add a few back in when I put my card together.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes,
I'm going to have a few questions here for you.
absolutely.
And this is kind of going back to the squares we were showing earlier.
Yeah.
We have a few folks wondering what size the squares are approximately,
Okay.
and about the square cutters themselves. We have a fan of the stitching that kind of has on the trim, so they want to know what brand these dies are.
Okay. I think I think the stitching, I think it is from a different brand. I know Michaels carries a nesting die set that is the squares, and it had the same sizes, but I'm not sure that it had the stitching.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I think the one that Michaels carries is just a straight square. The one I had in my house is one that I worked on a design team with a group. So am I okay to share that, or would we prefer not to?
Yeah, you referring to the dies, or
Yeah.
um I mean, I don't see why not, just
Okay.
to have this person's question answered. But
Yeah. So it's a company called Rubber Necker, and they have a bunch of different nesting dies. They have all different shapes, and some of them have like a scallop, and some of them have that stitching edge to them.
oh, okay, I gotcha.
Yeah. And then let's see. I have a ruler. So the outer is right at 3 inches. So the big square is a 3 inch square, and the little square is 2, and so that's going to be 4 5/8. Double check. And that is like almost exactly, or maybe, yeah, 3 inch and 2 5/8 is what those are looking like. So the
Okay,
one was right here, the other one came in right there.
gotcha. And
Uh,
we also have a few people wondering what brand of scissors you're using.
oh, there's a couple different brands out there. I honestly, boy, I don't even know. The one that a lot of people have and are most easy to find are the Cutter Bee, and they're actually yellow and black. And I have a pair of those, but they're in Alaska.
Oh, okay.
Um, so I would look for those, and I know that's something that Michaels carries because I know they carry that brand. Um, this I was given in. I had to separate all of my supplies in 2 locations, and so this is the pair that ended up in Des Moines.
Gotcha. It's still very nice, very precise cutting.
It is, and I will be honest, having come from an art background, fine art background, I went years doing this type of cutting with a pair or a craft knife, like an X-Acto blade.
Ah,
I did
gotcha.
all of my fussy cutting with an X-Acto blade, and a very good friend of mine who was a scrapbooker was like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that?" I'm like, "Because you can't get this kind of detail with a pair of scissors." And they're like, "Here, try these scissors." And she handed me this pair of little Cutter Bee scissors, and I'm like, "Okay, I'll give it a try." And of course they work, like you can get
Magic.
things done in half the time, and they're really sharp. Most of them have kind of what's a non-stick surface too, which is awesome if you're going through things that have a little bit of adhesive on them, that it doesn't stick to the metal, which a regular pair of scissors are going to have issues with that. But especially with the shorter blade, because most of us, if we've got a nice pair of sharp scissors, it's the bigger Fiskars, like orange handled scissors. It just, for this small work, it's hard to get your image tucked in there. It's cumbersome. And so having the shorter blade is super, super nice.
I will say too, from an art standpoint, having right materials or just having the right kind of products whenever you're crafting really does make a difference. And
Oh yeah.
definitely see that with the scissors. That's a very obvious,
Yeah.
especially the viewer right here watching this. So,
Right tool for the job. And I think that was part of it, Shannon, that my background, I had not experienced having a good pair of scissors before. And so I leaned into using the tool that worked better for me. And so when someone introduced me to the scissors, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is going to save my hand like years of really hurting, because using a cutting blade to do all of this little fine, intricate work is really hard on your hands. All right. So we've just about got these cut out. And it's always hard at the very end because there's just not as much to hold on to. So I've got these two little guys, yay, yay. And then I'm going to use two types of adhesive. I have a monster tape gun, and this is from Scotch, and you can find these guys, and they come with these huge monster wheels of tape. It's a double-sided adhesive, and we're just going to start building this card base. So I'm using this because it's fast and easy. I tend to go a little crazy with tape. And then I have to slow down. So I end up getting it kind of covering up my card base. If I don't, I end up with a corner hanging off. And I tell people this all the time. I'm infamous when I'm doing this of having to remove something and stick it back down again and tearing things. So I apologize ahead of time. All right, so there's that. Then I'm going to attach my sentiments. I'm going to try to get that as square as I can. I know several crafters who would pull out a ruler at this point and really get this nice and square. Again, I tend to be an eyeballer. I just feel like the people that I send cards to are not going to pick this up and say, you know, the bottom edge here is about a 1/16 of an inch wider, or it's slightly tipped. Most of the people that I send cards to are just thrilled to have a nice greeting card in the mail. And if they're not, maybe I shouldn't be sending them my hard work, you know? All right. So then we have some gluing to do. So I have a craft glue, and there's several brands of this out there. It's truly just a crafting. It's made for paper crafters. And I'm going to do two things. The first is I'm going to take this aqua square and I'm going to glue it to the plastic. So I'm just going to run around the edge. And I'm going to stick that down. One of the beauties of working with glue is it has a little wiggle to it. So if I don't get things quite aligned perfectly, I usually can do a little bit of kind of maneuvering and shift that around. But I'm going to get that glued to the plastic, and I'm going to set that aside for a second, and then I'm going to start gluing white squares together. So the question might have been, why not foam? Because a lot of people will use foam to create that shaker window. Here's my answer. A lot of times foam kind of comes in one width, like a 1/4 inch wide or a 1/2 inch wide. And if it's too wide for my little die cut, then I end up having to literally cut it like in half or in a third, and it's a pain. And you have to have it like perfectly match up. You literally have to make sure that every single little spot has a piece of foam so that the glitter can't sneak out, right? And by doing a stack of die cuts instead, I can end up with this nice solid square that is going to hold all of my glitter and stuff inside. And it's exactly the width that I want it. It's going to be the same width as that aqua square that sits on top. And I already know that. And so that is why I'm doing my little shaker card this way. This is one of those things that I actually looked up online and said, what else can I do besides foam? Because this is not doing, the foam is making a mess. I want a different way to make a shaker card. And this was one of the ways that seemed like, well, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the things we didn't talk about while we were coloring, but we kind of alluded to, was if you wanted to totally change up the card by maybe changing colors. And one of the things I would recommend is if you wanted to completely change colors and you were looking for 3 completely different markers, especially for the flower itself, if you wanted to do something completely different, I tend to try to work within like warm versus cool, meaning if I had my flower, if I wanted to use 2 completely different colors on my flower instead of a blue and blue green, I might come in and try using like a yellow and yellow red instead, or a blue and a violet instead. But I would try to pick colors that were kind of sitting next to each other on the color wheel. And that way I know that they're going to be kind of happier blending together. The colors that tend to get harder are ones that sit opposite on a color wheel. It's called complementary colors. And those color combinations are things like if I tried to blend a violet or a purple with a yellow, those two sit exactly opposite each other on a color wheel, if you've ever seen a full color wheel. And those colors create this kind of mushy gray brown mud when combined together. And so when that blending happens between your 2 colors, you're not going to get this nice kind of fade from one end to another. You're going to end up with kind of mud. So so violet and yellow would be a combo I would avoid. Red and green, believe it or not, are holiday colors. Those do not blend well together. And the other one that I would avoid are blue and orange. Those don't always do very well together either. I'm going to see if I can add a light from the other side. Sorry, everybody.
Hey, Michelle.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and start asking a few questions because we've got quite a few popping up
Oh,
here in the chat.
absolutely. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. I do like the color theory explanation. That really helps a lot. So we got a few. One is, which brand of glue are you using? The second is, how many of these little squares are you layering together? Is it traditional cardstock paper, or is it, what kind of paper did you choose to cut these square shapes?
Okay.
I'll stop there.
Okay. So the glue, there's a couple different brands out there that I would kind of keep an eye out for. This particular one is from Lawn Fawn, which is a very popular stamping company. You can find that at most crafting places. Lawn Fawn. Tombow also makes a crafting glue that comes in a small container similar to that, and it works really, really well as well. So those are 2 of the kind of big name brands that I would recommend people looking for. But what you're looking for is something that you can use that is acid free. And so again, you can go into the adhesive section of a crafting store where the scrapbook supplies and the scrapbook adhesives are, and you're going to find something similar that you can use. Finding it in a smaller container with a small nozzle is going to be helpful for something like this. I'm still going to get glue on my fingers, but then I walk around with paint and ink on my fingers all the time. So it comes right off. It's super easy. Let's see. The type of paper I'm using is the cheapest type of cardstock I can find because I'm not coloring it. I'm not doing anything with it other than gluing it together, and it's becoming the kind of window for my shaker card. So this is really inexpensive. You can buy a ream of it at like Walmart or Target, or even the less expensive cardstock at Michael's, the one that's made to be for your card bases. That's the perfect cardstock to use. And if you wanted to, you could do it out of a color and create that block look out of a color, and that would be a fun addition to the card itself. So it doesn't have to be white. In fact, it could be black, and that could actually add to the effect of your card. And then I think when we counted at the beginning, there are 10 of these little pieces of cardstock. And that's going to vary by how much height you want. This is giving me, I bet it's close to a 1/4 inch of height. But if you don't need it that deep, you could do fewer. And if your cardstock is heavier, you could do fewer as well. So that is completely up to you how deep you want that window to be. So the order of the next steps is kind of important. Did I hit the most important ones, Shannon, or do we have a few more?
I think you hit the most important ones. I think there is a question here about the plastic that you're going to place on top of it, and I
Okay,
believe Michael sells a clear plastic
they
under.
do.
Yes, and so they can find one at Michael's.
Absolutely.
And then the only other question that I'm seeing, I'm trying to scroll through to make sure I hit all of them, but I think the one last one I see here is can you use a glue stick? And I'm assuming you could, but it probably won't have as much punch or power to the stickiness
I would,
as what you're using.
yeah, I think you can. It's going to be messier just because of it, the way that it kind of hangs over. I mean, you could do it off kind of on a non-stick surface and hit all of those pieces. To me, it's a lot messier. Even though this is getting on my fingers, this is still going to be contained kind of on top of that square a little bit better.
Okay, and then one last question here. What is the size of the sentiment sheet that you have mounted on the purple paper?
So that is probably 3 1/4 by 5. So I've
Okay,
got about a 1/4 inch border all the way
okay.
around.
And then the size of the actual best wishes part is probably about maybe 2.5 inches.
I'm not
It just
sure. It
depends
was
on the
whatever
stamp.
size the stamp is. So it was 2 1/4.
Okay. And then whenever you stamped that onto the paper, you used just kind of eyeballing it.
I did. Yep. Yep. I wanted to get it right in the center because this little window is going to go kind of right on top of it. So I just wanted to try to get it as close to center as I could.
Okay. And then I just have one more quick question, then I'll be
Yep.
quiet. But is there a brand of die cutter that you want to recommend?
No. There's a few out there, and most people are having whatever works best. Some are really economical size wise, in that you can get a smaller one for the amount of space you've got. Some of them are bigger, some of them have plates that are less expensive or more expensive. There's, of course, the electronic ones now that you could actually do this with. You wouldn't, if you have a way, there's several that you can actually create. I want a little window, and then you tell it how many you want, and that would be super easy and fast. Um, Faster than even the rolling through die cuts. For me, because I had the square die cut, this worked really easily, but there's not one that I would personally recommend necessarily. It's kind of whatever they've got and whatever fits your needs the best, for sure.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay. So this next part, I've kind of I'm going to tell you, there's an easy way to do a shaker like this and there's a hard way to do it. So I'm going to show you the easy way. So I'm going to actually glue my stack onto my card. Okay. So I'm going to do that first. I've done this the hard way in that I've put my plastic on this little window and kind of closed it up first, and then tried to put the glitter inside the window and then tried to attach the window to the card. Much harder. So I would encourage you to attach your little stack onto your card front. So now I've got this kind of ditch, right? I've got a little trough ready for all my little elements. And then it's just ready to go. When it's facing up, I can see where everything's going, which is a big bonus. I'm going to take a pinch, or I can shake these in if I don't want them all over my fingers, but I'm going to take a pinch of these fun little sequins and doodads. And you could have little beads, but I'm going to get as much of that into that little window as I want. Now, it's really easy to get excited about the glitter and overfill it. I want it to be able to move around. So it doesn't take a ton. So I've got this little group, and then all I have to do is glue this guy down. And see, I can see exactly where I'm putting it. It should make sense, but I'm not the person that always does things in that order. Sometimes I go in the opposite order, so I'm just trying to help ease your pain. Don't go the other way. Put the window on the card and stack up from there. It is easier. So then I square this guy up, and now all my little elements are glued right inside there because I used the exact same die cut to create that little stack. They all line up nice and tight. And see, when I use foam, sometimes if I didn't cut it quite right, the foam is sticking out in my window. And so that's why I thought I'd give this a try, and it worked pretty slick. And then two last things. I'm going to glue this little guy, and you can either put your glue on your flower, or you can come across and add a little bit of glue to your frame. Either way, I could do it on the flower. My concern about putting the glue on the flowers, I can't, like, I have to figure out right where it's going to touch that frame. So I'm a little more confident putting it on the frame itself. I'm going to do the same thing down here. Light little bit of glue. And hold that down for a second. The really nice part about crafting glue, and again, I'm just saying crafting glue because there's so many different lines out there. The nice part about this is it does dry fairly quickly. So I'm not having to kind of step away. And then I've got this fun little window with all these little sequins and sparklies. So a couple optional add-ons. I did this on mine, on my other one, I took a few, they don't want to come out. I took a few little tiny sequins, and I didn't try to do like the little glitter, but I took a couple little sequins and I just added one little dot of glue, and I know there's tools to do this, but I tend to use my fingers and add a couple little sequins just to add a little pop of color outside the window. And see, I play with it, and then I just need to let it sit on the glue, and then it's good. And then remember, we cut off all those little black dots. You can come back in. This is a Copic multi-liner, and I'm going to come back in because I like those little dots, and I'm going to add a few of them. And it doesn't have to be anywhere in particular. I'm just adding them kind of around the edge. I'm going to add a few of them back in, down on that cream cardstock. And to me, adding those sequins and adding just a few little black dots kind of adds this other dimension. It kind of locks it down on that card again a little bit better, which I just like the look of it.
Michelle,
Yes.
I do have a quick question.
Okay.
Because of the height of this shaker card, do you
Yes.
have any envelope sizes that you recommend, or is there any issue whenever you slide it in an envelope and mail it off?
There is not. This will still fit in your standard. Is it A2? It's either A2 or A4. I'm going to get the size wrong. It fits in a standard envelope.
Ah, gotcha. Okay.
I'm disappearing. Just a second. See if I can find one. No, I can't. I thought I had one nearby, but I don't. No, but even with the depth of it, I can still get it in a standard. Absolutely. So it just goes in a regular envelope.
Yes, there's a Michelle in the chat that says A2.
A2. Thank you, Michelle. And I know who that is.
Yes. Yeah, so awesome. I'm trying to see if there's any more questions. I'm not seeing anything pop up in the chat besides they all want to see you again and everybody loves you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah,
So let me go ahead and pull over. We've got all of these fun places to connect in with Copic and myself. So this will give you kind of access to all of what Copic is doing here in the US. And then over on the right-hand side, this is other places that if you're interested in finding more of what I'm doing personally, these are all places you can find me. I'm sorry that it's not the same. I know I made a huge mistake there, that it's not the same on on all of my different Instagram and Facebook and all of that. But I do have a class online that's going right now. So if people were interested in more Copic instruction, you can find that. The easiest place is to look over at my blog at scrapweaver.com. And then we want to make sure if you guys are doing projects or you want to see more about what's going on at Michael's, make sure to hashtag Make It With Michael's. We would love to see your projects. So make sure to hashtag that and share what you're doing. But I would love to see it too. So if you want to come over and share it on mine or even kind of hashtag me so that I can find it, I would love to see what you guys come up with.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of good feedback and a lot of people really love the shaker card. So I'm really glad you could join us today, Michelle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I will for sure be back in May and October. For sure. We think we've already got those on the calendar. We're really excited about those. Completely different projects, totally different techniques. So make sure to come back and find more fun things to do with your Copics.
Okay, awesome. May and October. So look out for those announcements coming up. Other than that, I think that we're all pretty much wrapped up here. So thank you guys so much for joining us for another fun Copic class featuring our fantastic instructor, Michelle.
Thank you.
I hope to see you guys soon, and Michelle will be back in the spotlight in May.
Thanks you guys so much for coming, for attending. Make sure to keep in touch. Love to see you guys again.